There are three things that every Super Bowl contender needs to have to win it all. And we're breaking down if the Falcons have what it takes.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka the Jolly Green Giant, and aka Mr. aka. And of course, I've been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen, your first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to talk about sort of how you build a winning team in today's NFL and how you potentially can make a deep postseason run like we hope the Falcons can do at some point in the near future. And the reason why we're having this conversation is mostly because, we've been talking a little bit off and on about over the couple of weeks since the Falcons added Kirk Cousins and whether or not that sort of singularly elevates this team to being a true contender in the NFC as well as the NFL. And also we're talking about it because there's not a whole lot else going on with the Atlanta Falcons because it does appear that they're done in free agency. Maybe we get one or two veteran minimum signings between now and the draft. But, as the next 4 weeks of the draft unfold or the pre-draft process unfold, we'll have a lot more guests on to talk about the draft. But, there aren't too many opportunities where I get to really dive into this. And I want to, because if I wait till June and July like I normally do, like no one's going to be listening to podcasts during that time. So at least now I'll get some eyeballs. But, it all starts with the quarterback, right? That's one of the three boxes that you need to check, right? And those three boxes are you need to have a quarterback, you need to have an explosive offense, and you need to have a defense that can stop a good quarterback in an explosive offense as the sort of three boxes that you need to check in order to build a true contender. And to me, this is the lens that I evaluate all football teams, whether we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons or any team in the league. If you check these three boxes, you're, a really good football team that really has a chance to make a run and do some damage. And if you don't check all three of these boxes, it's going to be harder for you. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's going to be a lot harder for you to do that. So when we talk about the quarterback, everybody knows having a good quarterback is necessary to be successful. Everybody's looking for Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady, that sort of singular great GOAT, whatever you want to call it. And, good luck good luck finding that guy. There's usually only like one of those guys playing at a single time. We'll remember that 2018 AFC Championship game as when those two guys crossed paths the one time they sort of did, as well as the 2020 Super Bowl. But, there's a reason why if you go back to the last 25 AFC Championship games, either Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes have played in 18 of those. So, you need to have a quarterback that is capable of putting the team on his back. Now, I don't think you need those caliber of quarterbacks like a Mahomes or a Brady that can do that, most weeks, right? You just kind of need to get that sort of sweet spot where the quarterback can essentially black out, right? And wakes up and they're like, oh man, I just blacked out. What happened? Oh man, you blacked out for a month and you went on this 3 or 4 game run in January where you threw 12 touchdowns and 1 interception. And, Joe Flacco in the Ravens 2012 playoff run, Eli did it twice. Matt Ryan essentially did this in both 2012 and 2016. Matt Stafford did this a couple of years ago with the Rams. And the question is now with Kirk Cousins, is he capable of doing this? I think he is, right? And we had a conversation with Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings about 10 days ago on the podcast, and he talked about Kirk's lack of consistency, right? And the need to sort of string together 3 or 4 games of high-level play. And you've seen glimpses of this with Kirk, right? And you couldn't get it sustained for an entire season, but you saw glimpses of these sort of 3 or 4 game stretches where Kirk really played at a high level. And that shows us he's capable of doing it. It just hasn't necessarily meshed to a point where the Vikings were able to do it at a time where, it coincided with them making a real strong push in January. And so, I think we could see it here in Atlanta. Maybe we'll see. It's possible, right? We have sort of 9 seasons of Kirk Cousins. And so we can make pretty semi-educated guesses on whether or not he can do it. And, we've seen good play from Kirk Cousins, and arguably his best play came this past year before his Achilles injury in year 9. And we saw similar things happen for Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan's 9th year in the NFL. He won an MVP season. Drew Brees, Peyton Manning are 2 other players that won their first Super Bowls in their 9th seasons in the NFL. But the big difference between those guys was, those guys were about 5 years younger than Kirk Cousins is today, right? And so even after their careers seemingly, quote unquote, peaked, if you want to say it did, in year 9 for those guys, they were able to maintain a high level of play thereafter for like 5+ years. And you're probably not going to get that with Kirk being at his age. You might get 2. Hopefully you get 3. We'll see. But, I've seen a lot of people say, Kirk was playing at an MVP caliber level before his injury. I don't quite 100% agree with that, but he was on a 4-game stretch where, at least according to his PFF grades, he was the highest graded quarterback in the NFL. So I get why people say that prior to his injury. And so if we can get that sort of play from Kirk Cousins in the month of January, assuming the Falcons, or get good enough play from Kirk and the rest of the team from September through December, I do think he's capable of doing that, but we just need to see it, right? And we just haven't seen it yet, but I think he's capable of doing it. Now, when it comes to how confident I am that Kirk Cousins is capable, that's where I think a lot of the questions around Kirk Cousins is, because I'm not super confident that he will do it since we haven't seen him do it. Like, for example, to illustrate this point, like if you're asking me to bet how much money would I put on Patrick Mahomes doing it, I'd be like, I'll put $5,000 on that because that's easy money. It's a guaranteed winner because I've seen Patrick Mahomes do it like 5 times, right? If you're asking me how much I'd be willing to bet on Kirk Cousins, relatively speaking, like maybe I'll put a $5 bet, right? Just because like I haven't seen it enough. I'm not that confident in it. And I'm sure like we can go through the list of the other, 10, 12 top quarterbacks in the league and put different price points on, where we think their chances of being that sort of guy that can kind of black out and wake up and have it and through 12 touchdowns in their last 4 games in January and February. So, that's where we're kind of at with Kirk Cousins, where it's just like, yeah, he's probably at the very bottom of that list of probably the 10 to 12 quarterbacks that you would feel, have a decent feeling about having those sort of blackout month. And, we'll see, we'll just sort of have to see about that. But, the quarterbacks get all the attention, right? Because you're just looking at an individual player and you can basically look at that guy and say he either has it or he doesn't, right? But the other aspects of building a sort of championship team, it's a little harder to tell. And the next one we're going to talk about is the explosive offense, because it's not just an individual that leads to an explosive offense. It's often the other 10 guys on the field, in addition to the quarterback, that you have to sort of surround that quarterback with in order to build that explosive offense. Not to mention the play calling matters a ton. And we'll break that down, guys, as we continue today's How to Build a Super Bowl Winning Team here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. Now, guys, I want to tell you about GameTime, the fast and easy way to buy tickets to all the sports, comedy, music, and theater near you. And the great thing about GameTime, guys, is, you can just open up the app, and I should do that right now. Like, you can just open up the app and you can immediately see sort of what is available in your area. Like, I can just go on the app and hit one button and see, the tickets available tonight for the Blazers Hawks game, right? And at State Farm Arena, and they already have sort of the the flash deals that are limited time pricings, the cheap seats, and all that stuff. You get the all-in prices. You're not going to get hit with hidden fees, all that and more. So GameTime allows you to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, and the game tip off is at 7:30, so I can wait an hour or two. And from when I'm recording this, probably by the time you're listening, the game is about to tip off. But you can just go on the app and buy the tickets, and all you got to do is download GameTime, create an account, use code Locked On, especially if it's your first purchase, and you'll get $20 off. Again, terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code Locked On, LOCKEDON, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So are you guys tired of watching, your 4-letter networks and seeing all the screaming all day? Well, just switch over to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, the first of its kind, giving you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Check out Locked On Sports Today, as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta if you want more local flavor for those biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. It's a streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, longtime listeners know that I often preach about the need for explosiveness on offense, and that's due to the fact that when you get into January and you need to beat teams, right, you're often facing some of the best defenses, and the best defenses are not going to let you sort of methodically dink and dunk your way down the field, right? Like the further you go in an NFL season, the competition levels up. That's, the nature of it, right? Now we know that, like, because of the playoff expansion to 14 teams now, like, there is a higher probability that you could face a less than juggernaut sort of team in the first round of the playoffs. And that's why you often hear say, like, oh, like, yeah, they can get to the second round. Like, you hear me talk about the Falcons and say, like, yeah, they're a second round playoff team, because it's like there's a decent chance that you might play a relative weak team in round one of the playoffs. But then when the competition starts to get real in the second round of playoffs, often when you're playing, if you're a lesser seed, you got to go on the road and play a 1 or 2 seed. It's going to be a lot harder to, win those games and start to string together, the 2 or 3 more wins that you need in order to build that Super Bowl winner. But as I said, the hallmarks of good defense is, like, they're not going to allow you to string together 10 to 12 play scoring drives and convert multiple third downs and whatnot, in order to score points, right? You got to think of it like the battle between offense and defense is like, a dam, right? The defense is the dam, and you're trying to break the dam in order to score touchdowns, right? Scoring touchdowns matters, right? And the dam has a crack in it, right? And you, as the offense, you're trying to exploit that crack. And so you can sneak out there one night and get a hammer and a chisel and start chipping away to try to, bust that crack. But how long is it going to take for you to do that? Eventually, morning's going to come, right? And you're not going to have busted the dam hammering out that chisel with that crack or whatever. And some security guard's going to be like, hey, what are you doing down there? I'm like, oh, I'm not doing anything. Then you'll get arrested and all that stuff. So, instead, being an explosive offense is in the dead of night, rather than, sneaking out there with a hammer and chisel. You're sneaking out there with some C4, and you stuff that C4 in the crack and then light it, and boom goes the dynamite, as they say. And all of a sudden, you blow up that dam. We're not suggesting anybody goes out there and commit terrorist acts, but, like, in this analogy, blowing up that dam is scoring the touchdowns, right? And so this was a major issue for the Falcons under Arthur Smith. We talked about this like 2 weeks after we hired him. We questioned whether or not his play calling was, quote unquote, intentional when it came to designing explosive plays, right? A lot of the explosiveness in the Tennessee offense felt like, watching the film, it was a lot more of Derrick Henry and AJ Brown being dudes, right? Taking sort of normal plays and turning them into big games because they're different, right? And it's part of the reason why I think we saw the Falcons invest the premium draft picks in the top 10 in the 3 drafts under Arthur Smith, in trying to find dudes like Kyle Pitts, like Drake London, like Bijan Robinson. Now, you contrast that with Kyle Shanahan, and his play calling was, quote unquote, intentional when it came to designing explosive plays. Yes, he's had dudes on his rosters like Julio Jones, like Christian McCaffrey, like George Kittle, etc. But when you go back to, say, 2016 with the Atlanta Falcons, even in the games where he didn't have those guys, and we saw a couple of those games with Julio Jones out of the lineup, with Mohamed Sanu out of the lineup, the Falcons offense remained explosive. They were still the most explosive offense in the month of December in that 2016 season, even though Julio, only played in half of those games, right? And so it was really the design of the offense that led to the explosiveness. And when you add dudes to that design of an offense, you get, that sort of perfect marriage that led, to the Falcons, being a Super Bowl team in that 2016. And you've seen it the last couple of years with the 49ers, with all the dudes that they have and his play design and whatnot. And it's why San Francisco has been in the conference championship game in the NFC for 4 out of the last 5 years. Now, they didn't necessarily get it from the quarterback. Jimmy Garoppolo was definitely not blacking out in January and be like, oh, I woke up and, I threw 8 touchdowns in the last 3 games or something like that. No. Now, Brock Purdy is closer to that sort of blackout quarterback. And, the scary thing about Brock Purdy is, he hasn't even reached his peak yet theoretically, like the player that he's going to be over the next 3 to 5 years should be better than the player that he is right now. And maybe that is the guy that does consistently black out with the weapons that they have and all that stuff. But, we'll leave that conversation for Locked On 49ers. But, the Falcons have obviously spent a lot of resources over the last 3 drafts collecting guys that they think are dudes in Bijan, Drake London, and Kyle Pitts. And now the question is their play caller, Zac Robinson, a first-time play caller, an untested play caller, all that stuff, where does he sort of fit? Like on one end of the spectrum, you have a Kyle Shanahan. On the other end of the spectrum, well, not the other end of the spectrum, but somewhere closer to that other end of the spectrum is Arthur Smith, right? And so the question is, where does Zac Robinson fit on that sort of spectrum? And we, at this point, we just don't know, right? Now, I think based off of the moves that the Falcons have made this offseason, or lack thereof, if you ask me, I think they're betting on him being a Shanahan type, right? Again, whether he's as good as Shanahan, but somewhere on that side of the spectrum. Because when you look at the weapons that they've added at wide receiver, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, Ray McLeod, we're not talking about dudes, right? We're talking about guys that are much more along the lines of an Aldrick Robinson, along the lines of a Taylor Gabriel that we saw in that 2016 season when the Falcons didn't have dudes, right? You look at Taylor Gabriel, for example. The 2 years that Kyle Shanahan was his play caller, he had 19 20-plus yard plays in those 2 years. And you look at the 4 years where Kyle Shanahan wasn't his play caller, he had 18 20-plus yard plays. So basically, he was twice as explosive under Kyle Shanahan as he was under any other offensive play caller. And we also saw Taylor Gabriel be kind of the number 2 playmaker opposite Julio Jones during that Falcons 2016 playoff run. And maybe we're hoping for that type of performance from Darnell Mooney or Ray McLeod or Rondale Moore in the future in Atlanta, should the Falcons get that far. But we haven't necessarily seen that. So we'll see if that. But to me, the question, in addition to, we kind of know that those guys aren't necessarily dudes, but I think a big question is also, are the 3 guys that the Falcons have added dudes? Are they truly dudes, right? We've seen flashes of them being dudes. Guys being dudes. And the question is, are we going to see more sustained, rather than flashes of it? Are we going to see it consistently like you see with, those high end, the Christian McCaffreys, the George Kittles, the Julio Jones that we've talked before about, Derrick Henry, etc. And, we'll see, right? And I think part of the reason why this doesn't get nearly as much attention as the quarterback does when people talk about, are you, a contender or not, because it's harder to glean because there's not one individual that turns you into that, right? Like, now, granted, if you have a great play caller like a Kyle Shanahan or a Sean McVay or somebody like that, yeah, it's easier to look at that individual and say, yeah, they'll be able to put, whoever they have, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Robert Woods, etc., in a position to be successful. But most teams are not going to have play callers on that level. Those are arguably 2 of the top 3 play callers in the NFL. And more than likely, again, maybe we're having a different conversation about Zac Robinson a couple of months from now or whatever, but more than likely he's probably not going to be on that level. So you're going to have to make do with something else. And so, it's really it's less about the individual and it's more about the sort of collection, of the play caller, the quarterback, and the talent around him. And so I think the other difficult part of that and why it doesn't get nearly as much attention is because there's not a single blueprint. There's not a single, as they say, there's more ways to skin a cat. When it comes to building the offense, do you have it at the wide receiver position? Do you have the tight end? Do you have it running back? All those things, can change from team to team. And so there's no singular blueprint to how do you build an explosive. Well, you need to have this, right? In common, most teams usually have weapons at wide receiver. They have playmakers at wide receiver when it comes to that, because it's probably easiest to dial up those explosive plays to a wide receiver that runs, a 4-3 or 4-4. But at the same time, we've seen plenty of explosive playmakers that aren't, running 4-2s and 4-3s, right? It's easy when you see a Tyreek Hill, but Devontae Adams is out there cooking dudes and whatnot. So, that's where that comes in. And so time will tell if the Falcons have that. Like, again, theoretically they do with Zac Robinson and Drake London and Bijan Robinson and Kyle Pitts, but time will tell if we see that consistently enough to the point that, if and when the Falcons do play a game in January, you'll feel like, okay, they have a significant competitive advantage over their opponent because they have all these dudes, right? But that leaves us with the third box that needs to be checked. And what happens, of course, is when you're facing a team, in all likelihood, at the deeper you get in the postseason, that does have these quarterback and explosive plays, playmakers, box checks, box box boxes checked. Sorry, I can't speak. Right, you need to have a defense that can slow these offenses down. And that's where we'll wrap up today's episode and talk about whether or not the Falcons, have what it takes to build that type of offense. So, guys, say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel is going to let you bet on every game of this year's tournament. Whether you're betting on the 1 seed or the big upset, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, and you can even pick who's going to win it all, right? And of course, it's not just March Madness as we're closing down the month of March. Right, if you're going to join FanDuel, you need to find things to bet on in April. And of course, you got the NFL draft, you got NBA, you got NHL. It's all there at FanDuel. All you got to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started again. And you can bet on the NHL, the NBA, the NFL draft, or you can bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. So tomorrow, as your first listen, we will be joined by Jarvis Davis to wrap up the week, and we'll sort of get Jarvis's thoughts on all the things that have happened in the last week since we talked to Jarvis, I guess. We'll see. So that will be your first listen tomorrow. But today we'll wrap up by talking about you need a defense that can essentially be a speed bump, right? With all this explosive offense and dynamic quarterback play, you're not going to be able to shut down these offenses in today's NFL. And we understand the rules keep changing, and it gives the advantage to the offenses. And, that's part of the reason why people are, really up in arms about the hip drop tackle, or I should say the swivel hip drop tackle, which, to me is just like, whatever, man, like this is the world we live in. Who cares? Less injuries. Like, oh my God, this is a terrible crime against humanity that, now there's going to be more healthy offensive players that can create all these explosive plays that we need in the NFL in order to win games. Like, oh, what a war crime. The NFL, Roger Goodell must be stopped. Bring him up on charges. But anyway, sorry. Basically you need a defense that can be a speed bump, right? You need to be able to limit the explosive plays. You need to be able to pressure the quarterback, right? And it's simple, but it's complex, similar to how to build an explosive offense. There's not some sort of singular way of you build it. But, you can just look at this past year, and there was one team in the NFL that led the league in sack rate and also allowed the fewest number of explosive 20-plus yard plays this past year. And I'll give you two guesses on who it is. And, if you know who won the Super Bowl, you'd have the correct answer. Of course, it's the Kansas City Chiefs. So they were also top 5 in both of those metrics in 2022. And the Eagles, the team that they beat in the Super Bowl, was number 1 in sack rate in 2022 and number 2 in fewest explosive plays allowed that year. And by the way, Kansas City and Philadelphia had the 2 most explosive offenses in the NFL in 2022. So again, you just kind of look at the last couple of years and it just completely illustrates all the talking points that I'm discussing on today's episode. But, when it comes to limiting explosive plays, we live in an era where defenses are trying to scheme ways to limit those. And you're seeing of that evidence by a lot more sort of too high safety shells, right? Cover 2, cover 4, cover 6 sort of things to try to limit the prevent those explosive plays. And we saw this to great effect, which, Kansas City had the most explosive offense in the league in 2022. And then they were middle of the pack in 2023, primarily because they lost some talent at wide receiver, or the talent that they retained at wide receiver was not very good this year, as well as the way that defenses were playing them. But then, of course, when they got to the postseason, their offense seemingly blacked out and they became the most explosive offense in the entire postseason run. And it's like, I wonder if there's a lesson there, right? It's like, like you don't necessarily need to do it in the regular season, but you kind of need to do it in the postseason in order to make that run as the Chiefs did. So we know that they were capable of doing them as we've seen them do it. So, scheme does help, but you still need to have guys on the back end that can slow down all these dudes, right? You got to be, you're not going to stop those guys, but you got to be able to contain them. And we saw the Chiefs do that very effectively in the Super Bowl with guys like Trent McDuffie and L'Jarius Sneed blanketing Debo and Brandon Ayuk in that game. And those guys were really not factors in that game to any degree. And it's easy to say, just get 2 lockdown corners. But, there's also running backs, there's also tight ends, right? And there's also teams that basically, okay, you got two great outside receivers. Well, guess what we're going to do? And you see so many teams doing this nowadays. We're just going to put our number one wide receiver in the slot, and he's just going to terrorize your nickel corner for the plays that we need him to. And you've seen that with guys like Ayuk and DJ Moore and Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and Tyreek Hill, 5 of the most productive slot receivers in the NFL, even though most of those guys, if not all of those guys, only spend maybe 20 to 25% of their snaps in the slot. And this is why you hear me talk about, hey, let's, put Drake London in the slot, especially if he's that type of dude, then, let's dial up these slot snaps and exploit that. But, you're going to need basically all this to say that, just having good outside corners is not going to solve your problem. You need to have good players at nickel. You need to have linebackers that can cover. You need to have safeties that can cover. And of course, you also need to be able to stop the quarterback, which is the basically the only way that you can do that, especially when you're going up against these top end quarterbacks that are sort of blacking out and, just going, completely unconscious on you. You got to be able to get that guy on the ground, right? You look at Patrick Mahomes' passer rating this past season, and I think even the previous year, it drops like 40 points when he's under pressure. And the same was true of Tom Brady. When you go back and you look at like the 3 times those guys have lost conference championship games over the last decade, right? It was, the 2015 Broncos absolutely annihilating. I think they pressured Brady 30 times in that game, right? The Bengals were able to get Patrick Mahomes on the ground 4 times in that game. The Patriots were able to sack Mahomes a bunch in that 2018 game. And that's like the only way you can do it. And this, to me, when we look at the Falcons, we talk about the quarterback, we talk about the play caller, we talk about the weapons. Like this is the area where you look at the Falcons and you're like, okay, of these 3 boxes, this is the biggest question mark, right? Because we think they have the quarterback, we think they have the play caller, we think they have the dudes, but I don't know if anybody thinks they have the defense that's going to be able to stop one of these premier offenses, right? You got AJ Terrell in the back end. That's a start, right? You have Jesse Bates, but Jesse Bates is not really locking down guys. Like Jesse Bates is a cheater, right? He's not locking down guys. He's taking advantage of all the other people that are locking down, right? When he finds a monogamous relationship, and again, this is a stretch of an analogy, guys, but when he's seeing, AJ Terrell locking down a guy, or D. Alford locking down a guy, or Jeff Okudah locking down a guy, he's going to cheat. And he's going to swoop in and pick off that pass, right? If you're following what I'm saying, but he's not the guy that's locking those guys down. So you need to add more of those guys at cornerback and at the safety position, especially to deal with some of these tight ends. We saw Richie Grant do an okay job at that last year. I know that's an unpopular opinion, but when you look at the entire season, right? He was okay at covering tight ends, but like okay is not going to cut it, right? And then you ask, like, who's going to get the quarterback on the ground? And it's like, okay, Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata are good pass rushers, but they're not in the primes. Their best years in terms of being that guy. Like if you're looking for a Chris Jones type of player, like they're not those guys anymore. Maybe they were those guys 3-4 years ago, but they're not that guy anymore. And so they're really more complementary pieces at this point in their career. And it's one of the reasons why so many people wanted the team to get Jaylen Carter, because Jaylen Carter has the potential to be that sort of engine that can drive your pass rush in the ways that Chris Jones does for the Kansas City Chiefs. Is Arnold Ebiketie, AK, that guy? Who knows? But like this is the year where AK is going to have to kind of show that he is that guy or not, because like, we're not going to sit here and wait around forever. So if he's going to be, that guy that can be that 10 sack guy and, get you 50, 60, 70 pressures that we're talking about, that can be kind of that engine for your defensive line and your pass rush, then this is the year where he's going to do it. And, that would basically require him to basically double his production this year. So we'll see if he's going to do that. I'm not going to necessarily hold my breath. I think he'll have a good season, but I'm not expecting him to be that guy that you can trust to go out there and win those matchups consistently. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people, myself included, as we've gotten closer and further away from free agency, it's like, okay, are they just going to go defense at the top of the draft to kind of fill these edge, corner, and safety needs and holes that they have, because they need to add those players? That's where we talk about when needs versus wants, right? You want another dude on offense. That's where the wide receiver, and you look at guys like Malik Neighbors and Roma Dunze, and you say, yeah, I think those guys have the chance to be dudes, but you do wonder a little bit, is they're one of those defensive players that can stop other guys from being dudes. Is Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, and Layatu Latu the top 3 edges? Are those the types of guys that when we get into January and they're facing off against Penei Sewell and Trent Williams, those guys can be relied to win those matchups? Do you think Quinyon Mitchell or Terrion Arnold or whoever you think the top cornerback in this draft class is going to be the guy that can lock down, the Brandon Ayuk's in the ways that L'Jarius Sneed and Trent McDuffie did this past year? Who knows, right, at this point in time? And then, Lord knows if there's a safety in this draft class that can, lock down Sam Laporta and George Kittle or anything along those lines. So those questions remain, unanswered for the Atlanta Falcons. We'll see what happens with the draft, but that is going to do it for us here. I hope you guys understand, sort of, this is the lens in which I judge all teams, right? Do you have a quarterback? Do you have an explosive offense? And do you have a defense that can stop the quarterback and stop the explosive offense? And right now, 2 of those boxes, you probably say maybe with the Falcons. If you squint and you go like maybe, we'll find out in September, right? And then hopefully we'll find out even more in January, but time will tell on that issue. But wanted to break that down, guys, because we won't get, we'll probably have an opportunity to do it later this year, but ain't nobody going to listen. When we get into that, y'all will be over it by that point in time. So wanted to have that conversation here on the podcast before, so that when you hear me skeptical of things of the Falcons, you understand where that skepticism is coming from, right? When we talk about this team, and so we'll see what happens with this team over the next, 6 to 9 months. But that's going to do it for us here, guys. Continue to check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.